our study from there. And of course, Ezekiel has gone through and told all the Israelites that they were going to return. And in chapter 40, God takes Ezekiel back to that site and he shows him what the future is, or what the future is capable of in this area. Verse 1 says, "In the 25th year of our captivity, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the city was captured, on the very same day the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he took me there." Notice how the specifics are nailed down, and how God, in his plan, has things that repeat on the same day, at the same time of the year, to emphasize the events that are taking place. In other words, to me, what this emphasizes is we have all of these world events that are rolling on and continuing, but yet God's plan is carried out to the exact time that God has planned to do so. In verse 2, it says, "In the vision of God, he took me into the land of Israel and set me upon a very high mountain. On it toward the south was something like the structure of a city. He took me there, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of bronze. He had a line of flax and a measuring rod in his hand, and he stood in the gateway. And the man said to me, 'Son of man, look with your eyes, hear with your ears, and fix your mind on everything I show you, for you were brought here so that I might show them to you. Declare to the house of Israel everything you see.' And now there was a wall all around the outer side of the temple. In the man's hand was a measuring rod, 6 cubits long, each being a cubit and a handbreadth. And he measured the width of the wall structure 1 rod, and the height 1 rod. And so he begins here, and really what Ezekiel is seeing, he's seeing what God's showing him to be the finished product of the return to Jerusalem and what the city is going to look like. And this is what's in God's plan. And so in looking at this, though, we see that the dimensions, from whatever they can find in history, that this facility like this didn't seem to have ever been built. And so in looking for an explanation for it, I want to turn back to Jeremiah chapter 18 and read verses 7 through 10, which may be something. Jeremiah 18, verses 7 through 10. This is what God has said to his people. He says, "The instant I speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom to pluck up and to pull down and to destroy it, if that nation again whom I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent of the disaster that I thought to bring upon it. And the instant I speak concerning a nation, concerning a kingdom to build and to plant it, if it does evil in my sight so that it does not obey my voice, then I will relent concerning the good which I said I would benefit it." And so what Ezekiel is seeing here is what God wants to happen. And it can happen if his people respond accordingly. And so the description that really begins here in chapter 40 is of that city and the dimensions of it. And as you go on through this, and I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on it, but I want to mention just a few things. Verse 43 of chapter 40 said, "Inside were hooks a hand's breadth width, fastened all around, and the flesh of the sacrifice was on the tables." And so This city that Ezekiel is seeing is in operation. In other words, it's already has the sacrifices that have been prepared, and they're there. And so this is what God is telling Ezekiel to tell the people that can happen if they're obedient to him. And of course, he identifies Zadok in verse 47, and he measured the court 100 cubits long, 100 cubits wide, 4 square. And I think it's interesting here to point out the 4 square. Remember the holiest of holies in Solomon's temple? 4 square, 20 by 20 by 20. And here, 4 square. And it comes up again as we go on through this. Also, in verse 4 of chapter 41, it says he measured the length 20 cubits, the width 20 cubits beyond the sanctuary, and he said to me, this is the most holy place. And so you go and make reference to this in 1 Kings 6 and 20, we find that same dimension. And so God's holiest of holies. And then he goes on, down in verse 13 of chapter 41. He measured the temple 100 cubits long, and the separated courtyard with the building and its walls was 100 cubits long. Also, the eastern face of the temple courtyard, 100 cubits long, 4 square again. The areas outside that were designed for it. Then he goes into discussion of the chambers and dimensions of the temple. And mentions in chapter 43, the fact in verse 4, it says, the glory of the Lord came into the temple by way of the gate which faces toward the east. Of course, there's some significance here too. First order, God occupies this temple. And so God's plan is for this temple to be built and to exist, and for the people to follow God's law and keep his commandments throughout this period of time here, because there's plans for this temple. And so the glory of the Lord came in, and he came in through the east gate. Nothing else comes in through this gate. And I hadn't been able to find it in history, but as I understand it, this gate is, where it existed, was sealed up. And people nobody ever entered this gate. And whether that's true or not, I can't attest to it. But what he's saying here, and what he'll say a little bit later on in verse chapter 44, will mention this east gate. But let's read verses, beginning with verse 10 in chapter 43. It says, Son of man, describe the temple to the house of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities. Let them measure the pattern. And if they are ashamed of all they have done, make known to them the design of the temple and its arrangements, its exits, its entrances, its entire design, and all its ordinances, all of its forms and all of its laws. Write it down in their sight so that they may keep the whole design and all of its ordinances and perform them. For this is the law of the temple. The whole area surrounding the mountaintop is most holy. Behold, this is the law of the temple. And so, not just the holiest of holies, but what he's saying is when you go back and when this is rebuilt, this whole area here, he says, is holy because it's God's residence. And then in chapter 44, beginning with verse 1, he says, Then he brought me back to the outer gate of the sanctuary, which faces toward the east, but it was shut. And the Lord said to me, This gate shall be shut, it shall not be opened, and no man shall enter it, because the Lord God of Israel has entered by it, therefore it shall be shut. And so he goes on. Verse 4 says, Also he brought me by way of the north gate to the front of the temple, so that I looked, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord, and I fell on my face. And so when it's built, when they go back and rebuild the temple, God says his presence will be there. In verse 15, he continues, says, but the priests, the Levites, the sons of Zadok, who kept charge of my sanctuary, when the children of Israel went astray from me, they shall come near me to minister to me, but they shall stand before me to offer to me the fat and the blood, saith the Lord. So these are the ones that are going to be the descendants of Zadok, are the priests that God has appointed for this purpose. Then in chapter 45, he goes on with the description. Moreover, when you divide the land by lot into inheritance, you shall set apart a district for the Lord, a holy section of the land. Its length shall be 25,000 cubits, and the width 10,000. It shall be holy throughout its territory all around. Of this there shall be a square plot for the sanctuary, 500 by 500 rods, with 50 cubits around it for an open space. So this is the district you shall measure, 25,000 cubits long and 10,000 wide, and it shall be a sanctuary, the most holy place. And so consider the size that we're talking about here with this. Of course, this city, Jerusalem itself, inside the walled area, the best I can tell is somewhere around a half a mile, give or take, some wide, and less than a mile long. But this area is going to be 7 miles long and 3 miles wide. It's going to be greater. It's going to be bigger. It's going to be much more than what it has been. In other words, Israel is moving from just a small area of worship into a much larger one. And then that other area there that he's talking about, of the 25,000 cubics, that calculates in my little mind somewhere around 0.8 of a mile. So we're talking about a considerable area here with this. And they're told to keep the Passover, to keep the feast, and to continue following God's law. Then in chapter 47, with all of that happening, he says, then he brought me back to the door of the temple. Looks like he's pretty well measured around it and described it all to him. He comes back to the door of the temple, and there was water flowing from under the threshold of the temple toward the east. For the front of the temple faced east. The water was flowing from under the right side of the temple, south of the altar. He brought me out by way of the north gate and led me around on the outside, the outer gate, to face his east, that there was water running out on the right side. Notice here again, he sees the water flowing, and he's going to show him where the water's going, but he can't go out the east gate. He goes out the north gate and walks around to where this is happening. And then he measures it. He measures 1,000 cubics. The water's up to his ankles. Now remember, this is the top of a hill now. There's no springs up there. So this water that he's describing is something that's going to happen here after this temple is reoccupied and reestablished. And then he goes on, another 1,000 cubits. It's up to his knees. Another 1,000, and the river was up to his waist. And then another 1,000, he can't get across it. In other words, it's ever increasing. The further it goes, the more it increases. And it could not be crossed. Verse 8, the latter part, its waters are healed. When it reaches the sea, its waters are healed. And it shall be that every living thing that moves wherever the river goes will live. Everything will live wherever the river goes. Let's notice Revelation chapter 22 and verse 1. Notice another description that John gives us of another location. And he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb. And so, what is this river? Jesus is coming. And that's what this is about. Christianity is going to be established. It's going to go forth from this temple, he says. And so that's why it's important for God's chosen people, Abraham's descendants, to go back to this city, to rebuild this city. Because God says, I've got plans for it. I've got plans for the world. And this is what's going to happen. Verse 11, but its swamps and marshes will not be healed. They will be given over to salt. And so there's areas outside of this free-flowing river of God that are not healed, not a part of it. And so we're going to have both of these situations continuing from that point. And then he goes on, chapter 48, and shows the divisions of the land. Beginning in verse 30, notice what he says. He says, these are the exits of the city on the north side, measuring 4,500 cubits. The gates of the city shall be named after the tribes of Israel. 3 gates northward, 1 gate Reuben, Judah, and Levi. East side, same thing. And he identifies the sons that will be named on it, and the west side. In verse 35, and all the way around shall be 18,000 cubits. The name of the city from that day shall be, the Lord is there. And so what he's establishing here, and the point that he's making, is that this physical nation is going to return, and they're going to continue until the river flows, until Christ comes. And what's the name of it? The Lord is there. And, you know, even today, Jesus says what? He said, if y'all are assembled in my name, I'm there. And so this description that Ezekiel is giving here is the beginning of what we now enjoy. Let's look at the book of Daniel. I asked John Benson not to remember the way I taught this the last time we were here, some 10 years ago. But I remember when I first started doing this, I felt a little deficient, and so I thought I needed to find out what everybody else knew about it. So I spent my time reading Adam Clark and Burton Kaufman and all of the great scholars down through history. And then I was up in North Alabama visiting with my kinfolks, and my brother-in-law, Sam Shelby, said, you need to throw those books away. You need to spend your time reading the Bible. And that's one of the wisest things anybody has ever said to me. And so going from that, that's where I spend most of my time. Not in the, I like to look at history and see those things that are pointed out there, but Daniel gets us from here to Jesus coming. And the other event is the total destruction, well, what they thought was the total destruction of the Jewish nation, but actually there was a war after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 132 to 135 that was just as brutal, if not worse, than the one that had passed during the destruction of Jerusalem. And also remember here during this time, now we've got Daniel. Notice where Daniel ends up. But he's Israelite slave that ends up in total control, except for the king, of the Babylonian Empire. How do you think that helped those that are in slavery? How did they get through? But not only that, what happens after Daniel? Remember Mordecai, book of Esther, and the struggle that they have? Think about the animosities that here we have all of this army and all of their soothsayers and their philosophers and all of these people in positions of authority, and they love that authority. And then this king comes in and puts a slave over us. And so you can understand the animosity that's there. And you understand why and the lengths that they go to have these people discredited and disqualified. And that's these events as they transpire. But let's notice what happens here as we go through it. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his gods, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his son. And then the king instructed as Phinehas, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles. In other words, he took the best of the best. Young men, verse 4, in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possession, knowledge, quick to understand, ability to serve in the king's palace, whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And so this is their purpose. They want people to serve this king, and so he picks the best. And they're to have 3 years of training. You know the story. And the 4 of them that are mentioned here, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Daniel, Belshazzar, Meshach, Shadrach, Abednego. Verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart. Where is he? He's in a foreign land. He's been taken prisoner. He's been selected to go through training to serve the king. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacy. You know the story. The wine and the meat, not kosher, so it's not fit for these Jewish people to consume. And so what's he do? Goes to the chief eunuch. We don't want to do that. Give us a chance to do something else. Chief eunuch says to Daniel, verse 10, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed you food and drink. King told you to eat this. Why should we see your face looking worse than the young men? Then you would endanger my head before the king. You see, making a mistake won't get you fired, get you killed. And so he's serious about doing his work in fear of his life. Daniel says, test us 10 days. And he does. And lo and behold, the end of 10 days, verse 15, features appear better than fatter in the flesh. And so it does good. For these 4 men, God gave them knowledge, verse 17. He didn't open their head and pour it in. They worked at it. They were in school for 3 years. God gave them knowledge, skills in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. As a teacher, I've had people that listened. And I've had people that didn't. And Carla probably has too. those that learn, those that don't learn. But notice where these people are. Yes, God gave it to them. What's God given us? He's given us His Word. If we're to be filled with it, the only way that's going to happen is if we spend time with it. And that's what we're doing. That's what this is about. And so they worked at it. They wanted to be good at what they did. And God helped them. Now, where is the separation of their own initiative in working at it and what God accomplished? Not for me to speculate on. But God helps those that are striving. What's He say? We'll not be tempted above what we're able to bear. We can survive Satan and his onslaught. And we can be victorious. And these people truly are here. The king interviewed them in verse 19. None was found like Daniel and these other three men. Nobody like them. Verse 20, and in all the matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. That's 70 years. So Daniel survived. He got to see him go back. And I don't remember seeing his name listed anywhere. And so very possibly he wasn't one of them that went. But we'll cover that later. Chapter 2, second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. People who want to complain or criticize the Bible say, oh, you got a conflict here, David. Daniel was in training for 3 years, yes. Nebuchadnezzar was the general that came and captured Jerusalem. His daddy was king at the time. And so there's not a conflict unless we want to make one. And so in his second year as king, because after his daddy died, he returned and took over the throne. But when this was written, he was king. So in his second year, he had a dream. Either he forgot it, as the King James Bible says, or he just chose not to. But notice what he says in verse 9 about this situation. If you do not make known to me the dream, there is only one decree for you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. So whether or not the king could remember it is immaterial. But his point being is that he had listened to his astrologers and to all of these soothsayers, and he'd caught them in their lies. What are they trying to do? They're trying to influence their position and power under the king. And so they'll say whatever they need to say in order to accomplish their end. Anything like that going on in the world today? But the king says, I got this figured out. If you can tell me the dream, then you'll surely be able to tell me the interpretation of it. Verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king, says, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such thing of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. Well, now the soothsayer finally told the truth. God whose dwelling is not with flesh. And so, who are they serving? Verse 16. King's going to kill them all. They're hunting Daniel. Verse 16. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation. Daniel goes to the king. He doesn't know the interpretation of it. He just knows his God. And so he says, "Oh, king, give me a change." And what's he do? He goes home and gets his companions and they pray. That they might, verse 18, that they might seek mercies from God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And so here he is now risking his life going into the king. And then he goes home and prays about it. And I guess goes to bed, sleeps. God reveals it to him. And so when he wakes up, notice who he puts first. Verse 20. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever. Thank you, Lord, for what you've done." Couldn't help, while I was studying this, thinking about the song, "One Day at a Time." For, you know, it's good today. All you got to do is get on your computer, plug in "One Day at a Time" and mash the volume button, and you can sit there and listen to it. That old gospel hymn. And I thought, that's Daniel. That's what he's doing. One day at a time. For wisdom and might are his, and he changed the times and the season. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God, my Father. Of my fathers, you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we ask of you. For you have made known to us the king's demand. Enough to get me through another day. And so he takes Daniel. He tells him to take him before the king. Verse 26. Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel's answer. The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, and the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare it to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. Daniel said, I didn't do it. God did it. Credit where credit's due. He has made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. And as for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while you were on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. But as for me, verse 30, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone else, but for our sake who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. Verse 31, and so he tells him about it. You were watching, and behold, a great image. The great image whose splendor was excellent stood before you, and its form was awesome. And the image's head was of gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly iron and partly clay. You watched. All right, so he's showing him the statue. And then you watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold was crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floor. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream. Now we will tell you the interpretation of it, O king. And so he describes it to him. And the stone that's cut out. And he says, what does all of this mean? O king, you're the head. After you shall rise another kingdom, verse 39. Inferior to yours, then a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron. As much as iron breaks in pieces, that shatters everything like iron, and crushes that kingdom, will break in pieces and crush all the others. Verse 41, whereas you saw the feet and toes partly of iron and partly of clay and iron, yet the strength of iron, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. Toes and feet, partly iron, partly clay. Kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile because it's divided. Look at America. Strong, but divided. You saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. They will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix. And in the days of these kings, God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. The kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw the stone that was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, and the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king that this will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. And so they're promoted from this and made rulers. And Daniel sits in the gate of the king. That's the place to be, to know and be able to carry on your business. But this is certain. And so he identifies these nations. And he tells what's going to happen. And so this is sure, and it's set up, and it's going to happen. And of course, looking at it from a historical perspective, get it right in a minute, maybe. It's easy to look back and see it, to see the kingdoms, to see them come and go. The Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, Romans, and to see, look in Acts, look in the Gospels, and you see all of these things, how they unfolded and what happened. And that river still flowing and ever increasing. And so Daniel says, this is the way it's set up. This is the way it's going to happen. And so these events take place. And so they continue on through it. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar knows this. And then he goes on and sets up him a big image. In other words, it looks to me like here in chapter 3 you're seeing these other people trying to cause problems for Daniel. And so the king sets him up a golden statue, tells everybody to worship it. Verse 12, there are certain Jews that are not following what you say, O king. Pay no regard for it. Verse 13 calls them in. Y'all have an opportunity to serve my God. And if you don't, you're going to end up in a fiery furnace. And latter part of verse 15, and who is the God who will deliver you from my hand, he says. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to him, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. He will deliver us from your hand, O king. What are they saying? You can kill us, Nebuchadnezzar, but you can't separate us from our God. And if he doesn't save us, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your God, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. Do what you want to. Make it easy for yourself. All right, we'll continue from there next time. Let's have a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for your word. Help us to learn from it and apply it to our lives. Keep us close to you and forgive us. In Christ's name, amen.